Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute podcast. I'm your host, Rowena Itchon. In this episode, Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications, and I chatted with Richard Samuelson, Associate Professor at Cal State University, San Bernardino. Professor Samuelson, a historian, is currently working on a book on our second president, John Adams, and Adams' role in the founding of this country. Earlier this year, Professor Samuelson gave a lecture on the case for a political elite at the Heritage Foundation. Now you must be thinking, you've got to be kidding, a political elite? But hear him out. You'll be surprised. By the end of the podcast, you might find yourself agreeing with him and John Adams. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to PRI's podcast, Professor Samuelson.
Thank you.
So Donald Trump was elected president because a large part of the American electorate, perhaps for many years now, believe that Washington is dysfunctional. And the public wants to drain the swamp. And perhaps one of the most vilified institutions in Washington is a Senate. It has few working days. It hardly passes any laws. It rarely has debates and spends a good part of its time raising money. Take us back to the framers. Why did the U.S. need a Senate?
That was actually a controversial question. At the time, there was much discussion. If you do not have a House of Lords, because you have no Lords, why have a bicameral legislature at all? Why not just have one House? And they actually tried that in one or two states, particularly in the state of Pennsylvania. It didn't seem to work out so well. At least it was replaced by 1790. The consensus was it is very good to have a bicameral legislature and an executive with a veto, for that matter. The question is why? Why have a Senate? Why have a second House? If there are no aristocrats, there's no House of Lords. Now, it depends who you ask what the reasons for. Of course, we know how you wound up with it in the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution, James Madison, his initial plan, which he drafted, became the Virginia Plan proposed by the governor of Virginia at the start of the Federal Constitutional Convention, suggested that the people elect the lower house, and the lower house elects the upper house, which would elect the executive. That is not what we wound up getting. What we wound up getting is a distinct Senate, whereas they split the difference. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state had one vote. So those who wanted to keep that were in the driver's seat. They dug in their heels, and the compromise became what we call the Connecticut Compromise, in which we have the House of Representatives, which is elected based on proportion to persons. Hence, we have a census every 10 years to recalibrate the numbers in the House of Representatives, something that the old Parliament did not have. In the old days, there was no redistricting, there was no census, so you had rotten boroughs, which had a vote from, say, the 13th century, and there were now 5 people living in it, and they still send somebody because they never changed it. And whole towns, industrial cities grew up that had no representatives. That was changed eventually. But the purpose of the census and reapportionment was to fix that, to have a rough correlation between population, the number of people in the House. So wherefore the Senate? The Senate was the compromise. The other half, the equal states who had equal representation in the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, retained equal representation in the Senate. What was the justification for it? It's actually very interesting. If you look at the records of the convention, the Connecticut Compromise was proposed very early, that is in early June, but it was not agreed to till early July, and there was a lot of back and forth. People were very upset. The convention almost broke up. As I often joke in class, how worried were people? Benjamin Franklin, of all people, called for prayer. But what happened on June 6th, if you look at the notes, John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who was famous for his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, the most important reaction to the Townsend Acts of the late 1760s, and also Liberty Song, the song people sang at patriotic gatherings, which is united we stand, divided we fall, other lines like that. He said, well, we do not have lords, of course, or aristocrats, or baronies. We do, however, have states. So essentially, the theoretical justification for what became known as the Connecticut Compromise, Dickinson was actually from Pennsylvania. He was then representing Delaware. He had represented Pennsylvania in the Congress that ratified the Declaration. He disapproved of it. He didn't vote for it. He was absent, then promptly was in the field fighting. So he accepted the result of the loss. Anyway, he suggested we have proxies for baronies, essentially, which are the states. Now, what's fascinating when you look at the records, that's the day that Madison writes his letter to Jefferson complaining about the baneful influence of Mr. Adams. And I believe that's the day he gives his first speech defending the extended sphere, which he would most famously elaborate in Federalist 10. That is, how do you prevent abuse of majorities? That is, you have a larger republic rather than a small, and the people who get elected were more likely to be better people. And the only thing you can actually achieve consensus on in a large republic would be those things that generally are the common good. But this alternative view would be you have essentially a congeries of different interests in some ways, or different representations of of the states. They represent a different type of majority. They represent by proxy something like a House of Lords. So in other words, the ambition of people to be senators will draw them into the upper house. And that's precisely what John Adams' argument was. The reason why you have an upper house is you need to have some way to capture your elite and essentially to harness them. The bait you use essentially is ambition, desire for fame and prominence, dangling it like a bait before a fish, and they jump at it. And so that we contain the most ambitious people. And you can argue that that's essentially what the United States had in the 19th century, particularly from, say, the time of Madison's presidency through the Civil War, when the Senate was really the heart of the system. Back when it really was the world's greatest deliberative body, or at least arguably so. You had heroic length speeches from Daniel Webster, Robert Hayne, John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, among others, right? And every president from, I believe James Monroe to Buchanan had been a senator, with a couple exceptions. That is the General Zachary Taylor and William Polk, I believe it was, who was Speaker of the House, which is essentially as close you can be to being a senator without that. And Lincoln, of course, not a senator, but became a plausible presidential candidate because of the most famous senatorial campaign in American history. So what was going on then was you had essentially the states in the state legislatures elected senators, right? There's no popular election of senators. So who did senators become? They either became people, the powers that be, who ran the machines in the states, machines being used as a generic term, not in terms of the political machines like Tammany Hall necessarily. They put someone, they sent them to Washington and say, okay, you represent our interests. But the most ambitious among them, people like Henry Clay, they were the people who were in charge. And they negotiated, they were the swingmen between the parties in Clay's state of Kentucky and also the rest of his region, really, and the national government. Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun, the same thing. So you had a gathering of our greatest statesmen in the Senate, and the negotiation was between the state parties grounded in the state legislature and the people the state legislature sent to the Senate. And so they kept touch with the local political system and the national political system. And they were the people who ultimately worked through the compromise, from the Missouri Compromise to the Compromise of 1850. They had adverse consequences ultimately, but they kept the Union together, and other major legislation, right? So essentially what was going on is you had your most important people in the Union were in politics in the Senate, and you had, particularly with the age of Jackson, you had very high voting. 80% of people, eligible voters, voted, whereas prior to that, eligible voters often didn't bother. People are engaged in politics, they're talking about politics, and so everyone, or a significant number of people, feel they're engaged in the system. There may be significant party heat, but of course until the Civil War, where you had a dividing line between North and South, you had the people felt that they were represented in the system to a great degree, and therefore they felt they were being respected, and therefore thought that their work was getting done. In the 20th century, that all changed for a variety of reasons. For one thing, well, you could say after the Civil War, it became more corrupt. Henry Adams, John's great-grandson, quipped, it's U.S. government is of the people, by the people, for the benefit of senators. You started to have the party machines, notoriously Tammany Hall and the other machines, and the American people switched to popular election of senators. That was being done in several states before an amendment changed it in the Progressive era. And so now senators are elected directly by the people, and therefore not tied in necessarily to the states and the state legislature and the whole democratic process in the states. You add to that a few other elements. You have state governments, which are not as important as they used to be because we now have a federal police power, the police power being the power to regulate health, safety, and morals. Even Alexander Hamilton denied that the federal government had that power. He said when he defended the bank, he said, well, you can create a bank because that's following legitimate constitutional powers. We would not have the right to create a corporation. Oh, P.S. Madison is quite clear in this debate. Yes, one thing corporation is, it's a person in the eyes of the law. That is not a new idea whatsoever. Perhaps its exact meaning has changed over time, but the idea goes way back. But Hamilton said you can't create a corporation to regulate the police of Philadelphia because we do not have the police power with regard to localities. There is no federal police power. When you get a federal police power, that is, the federal government's regulating our lives down to the nuts and bolts of our daily activities, then you have a distant government that is, in fact, managing things that it cannot manage with any degree of connection to us because it's so few people. So one is the popular election of senators, ironically, and then they're doing so much they actually can't keep tags of all their laws, right? Think of Obamacare. It is, 70,000 pages of regulation, but 2,000 pages of actual law. So who wrote the other 68,000 pages? People who are not elected. So the actual electoral system is not in the center, and the Senate has let that happen. One other element, this is more the John Adams view of things. Why would the Senate work? It focuses ambition from the House up. That is, take a thought thought experiment. Jonah Goldberg pointed out it would be interesting. We should change the House. We should have 2,000. I can't remember the number he used. Say 2,000 members of the House of Representatives. One representative representing 700,000 people. It's just too many. This is actually a debate. Washington argued at the end of the Constitutional Convention, one person should not represent 40. Let's make it 30,000 people. That was something they kept renegotiating. But we kind of fixed the House at 435 people and the Senate at 100. Once you do that, the ratio between the two is no longer so noticeable. So you have 100 senators, 435 congressmen. They don't look so different. You look like you have two different houses that don't really explain anything different. Suppose we change that. We have 2,000 people in the House, and then let's go back to the original, take 20. Instead of having states, we have regions, 13 regions that each elect 2 senators, and then you have 26 senators. Then those senators would have a prominence that they would not have today, and they'd be looked to, they'd be discussed. In our age, they'd be on TV and radio, sought after, and their ego, thinking of themselves as special people, would force them, essentially, for their own self-interest as people who want to think they're important, to push back on the elements of the government they're kind of running on autopilot, because it's their job to take care of that.
Historically, the most powerful Americans were men like Daniel Webster and Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, and they were on the stage duking it out, and they were checked and balanced by the rest of the government. You've observed that America's elite, the billionaires, the Kardashians, the academic, those who want to shape or change policy, are actually outside of the political system, and as a result, they really don't have any accountability. They can't be voted out. So talk to us about this issue.
Yeah, a whimsical proposal is to suggest actually we need, I don't know about the Kardashians, but George Soros, Zuckerberg, other significant, the Koch brothers, Tom Steyer, people like that who are investing significant resources in trying to sway the way our political system moves. They should actually, instead of being on the sidelines hurling money in to move issues that they care about, they should actually be front and center in the Senate. And it's one thing, this is to have, say, the 19th century, the Tappan brothers who were anti-slavery. You're one issue, you focus on that, you want that to be changed. But if you are essentially, you have a whole political program that is to transform the way American politics functions, not just to deal with one issue, however major, then really what you're doing, if we have a democratic republic, you really should be in the system. And the other thing, as you mentioned, it was not just that Calhoun and Clay and those guys were checked and balanced by the rest of the system. They checked and balanced each other. If you had to go back a generation, Mellon Scaife and Coors and someone like Soros today, if they were all in the Senate, then they would actually have to be on stage. Put them on stage, have them duke it out. They also might moderate each other. They have to deal with each other on a daily basis. And they might, in fact, be some pushing and shoving, but politics is not going to exist without heat, right? The challenge is to keep it as only heat as opposed to shooting. But when you divorce power from accountability, that's when you have a problem. Particularly, in our case, it's a problem with democratic accountability, where the people feel that they do not actually have a chance to influence what the government is doing to the degree they believe they should. Now, ironically, you could say one thing that might actually change things in a moderate way is the election of Donald Trump. I mean, put aside someone like Bezos or Zuckerberg, who they are who they are because they're running these ginormous businesses and everybody knows who they are. They're famous. They get all that reward. But go down a tier to the other people who are merely billionaires. They merely have $5 or $10 billion. No one's heard of them. But this guy Trump, who's the billionaire like them, well, what have you done? He became president. You only have several $1 billion. So it might actually fire the ambition of some of these guys actually to get into politics, because heaven forbid that they have a lesser ambition to someone else. So ironically, it could actually produce a little bit of that. I'm not confident we'll have much of one, but it is something that will be interesting to see the impact on that. One other element, though, that's worth thinking about here is there are regional variations in the United States. The uniformity of law we see across the nation, because so much is done from Washington, that also causes part of the disconnect between what the voters want and what they do in Washington. And that's worth also keeping in mind. Partly senators were supposed to represent the diverse regions, diverse understandings of justice even in the union. And that's harder and harder to do when you have a kind of a national leadership class, which we have as well. You also mentioned academics. Now, few of them are as famous, or none of them maybe are as important as some of the billionaires who try to influence politics, but some of them are quite significant. Think of the most prominent op-ed columnists or or academics, right? Again, power without accountability is problematic. And so you do want accountability. The one thing I thought would be very amusing as a thought experiment, which is an example of this, right? We don't talk about this enough. If you consider the last 30 years and think about, say, Chile and now Russia, the former Soviet Union, we sent the Chicago economists to Chile. And there was some rough stuff going on. But if you look at the change over time, they've become much better, much more liberal in the classic sense. If you look at Russia, their economy really hasn't grown that much as a percentage, and they're still, essentially, they need a strongman tyrant to run the system, right? That's something we should talk about more, and we don't. But those type of debates are had merely by academics. If you had the people who are very invested in politics and ideas, and you had them on stage, they would actually be more central to our political life.
Well, Professor, I think you're selling the idea of a Senator Kardashian short. I mean, after all, she is setting criminal justice policy, she and Kanye, and Kylie, according to Forbes, is about to become a billionaire. So maybe she'll be running for president sometime soon.
Well, you never know, stranger things have happened. One thing, though, this is part of the argument from the founding period. What causes inequality? And John Adams says, well, looks, fame. If you have famous parents, you're going to have an edge in life. It's just the way things are. Similarly, if you're good looking, people will give you credit you don't deserve. It's simply the way human beings are wired, right? And we can't get away from that fact. There will be such equalities which are not rational in human life, and they're actually quite predictable. And your system can either account for them and recognize them and even use them to the benefit of the republic, or you can let them kind of go on their own way, and then they will quite possibly cause trouble. Though there's one other element here which has to do with power and accountability. If you think back to Daniel Borston's old book on the image and the pseudo events and people who are relatedly people who are famous for just being famous, right? Well, you knew that really couldn't last, right? It didn't occur to me when I first read that many years ago that what's going to happen is the people famous for being famous are actually going to start getting real power in our political system. And that actually, to a degree, that does seem to be happening.
Well, Professor Samuelson, I see this circus in the Senate, the way you describe it. So you've got the beautiful people and the billionaires who are funding their own campaigns because they can. What do you think that'll do for legislation? Wouldn't we get nothing passed that way?
We're not getting much passed now. That's the obvious answer, right? And the thing is, actually, though, they want to be recognized for having actually done something. People who spend their lives building up fortunes and actually doing things might actually be willing, once they're in there. Now, you wouldn't want a whole Senate based on people like that is probably a very bad idea. It probably wouldn't happen, right? You want to mix. You want to have people who are trying to assert significant power in our system accountable, and in the middle, there will be people who just kind of rise through the political system, maybe never make any real money, but they have power because they're good at politics or other reasons that they, of course, certainly belong there too, and that's part of what the system is supposed to be like. I mean, Daniel Webster wasn't born particularly wealthy, if memory serves. I gather he became fairly wealthy through court cases and other things over time. But it's not just the issue of wealth and power, it's also the issue of having people who are capable of doing politics. And part of the thing here, though, once you have that, is there a cascading consequence? If it becomes de rigueur for the most significant businessmen to want to become senators, well, there are only 2 senators in each state, well, then there's some cascading. You have to start out in politics, in local office eventually. Well, there's Congress, but then you got to go to the state government. And maybe the divorce we've seen between the people who stay in politics, they start off as legislative assistants, then go to the state legislature, then become congressmen. Think of someone like Anthony Weiner as kind of an example of that, an unfortunate example, right? Which I use advisedly, just an example of things can go wrong with this system, right? As opposed to, you want to have people who are governed and then take responsibility of government in turn. You're in and out over time. And instead, we seem to have a political class, or politicians, or people who kind of spent their whole lives quite often from being legislative assistants to moving up to another committee, big committee aide. Maybe they become a lobbyist, then they run for a small office, then if they're good, they run for higher office. But they never actually held a regular job. You want to have some back and forth. So there's more. You want a mix of all the above. Of course, you need some people who are very, very experienced. But the divorce between the American people and the American electorate and the people we elect is problematic. The other side we haven't mentioned is the 20th century, we created a very large administrative state, to use a term for it. And we have people who have jobs for life because they've tenured civil service, and they're writing our legal code. This is kind of a postmodern form of Rome nobility, right? And you have that class of people people in the bureaucracy who feel it's kind of their job to rule. And there's no democratic accountability because the myth, when they created it in the early 20th century, well, you had the social science PhD was new, the economics PhD, the sociology PhD, etc. were new, and people thought, oh, well, it's a scientific approach. We know what we're talking about. Very few people really believe that anymore, except people in the narrow disciplines, right? It's very hard to reconcile what people now think about just how clear the knowledge we produce in the academy is, and the myth that created the administrative state, which is there's neutral expertise, people generally agree what the issues are, and can generally come to a consensus about what approach is proper. In fact, these are political issues that involve serious discussions about which it's quite arguable the PhDs are no better than anyone else. It's one thing to say you need an engineer to tell you a bridge is not going to collapse, but it's quite another when you have to decide, well, no bridge is perfect. Do you want a 1 in 100,000 chance, 1 in a million chance, 1 in 5 million chance if there's, say, a 6.5 earthquake? I know there could be a higher one, but I'm just using that as an example, right? And suppose it costs 1% versus 50% versus 200% more for each level. Those are not questions answered by engineers. Those are ultimately political questions. And I do not know why people who have advanced degrees are any better at answering them than a normal person would be. You're negotiating different things, but we still sustain the myth that these are not type of issues that common people should weigh in on. And that's partly what's missing in our system. And of course, certain people would have more prudent answers to those questions, which is why you need to have kind of leaders and followers. And you want the more wise, more judicious people ultimately asserting authority. But I'm not sure we're having that right now.
You're writing a book on John Adams, and you believe that, as you alluded to earlier, when there's a runaway elite, the regular folks pick a powerful king type to bash the elites back in line, such as the billionaires and the academics and the experts. Do you think this is happening today and gave rise to Donald Trump?
I do. In fact, I actually have written about this. I think quoting essentially a bit from Adams' big book, The Defense of Constitutions, and saying, yeah, isn't that what we're seeing right now? And the argument is essentially this is a pattern one sees over and over again. When you have a runaway elite, he would call an aristocracy or some word like that, but very similar idea, that doesn't feel accountable to the people and is managing the system to its own benefit, particularly in a people that is democratic, that believes it's supposed to have a say. They'll get frustrated and they will lash out. First, they will try to work through the system in a normal way. And if the leadership class does not respond, they will essentially pick some leader to bash them back into line, essentially like the Hulk. Trump's smash seems to be essentially, the process seems to be bash the elites back into line so they can actually do what their job is, which is to do good for society as a whole, as opposed to serving themselves or serving those issues they think are important as opposed to those society as a whole thinks are important. And there might be considerable disjunction between the two. And of course, that's where some of the problem happens. And you can see this in the reaction to the Tea Party. Glenn Reynolds, also known as Instapundit, he pointed out the Tea Party, several people pointed out, they literally left their marches cleaner than when they got there. These are your wholesome middle American people as a very high percentage. They would pick up their own trash, pick up other trash that was there. They figured they're trying to do right. But they thought their needs were not being addressed. But the leadership class of both parties, if you look at some of Mitch McConnell's comments, even the Republican Party, which helped him maybe be majority leader, the Tea Party did. But they were concerned. They didn't like the Tea Party because it got in the way of the program he wanted to pursue, right? But when you don't pay attention to such a large protest movement and give them half a loaf at least, you're going to get worse. And what Reynolds pointed out is, if they do not take the Tea Party seriously, or when they didn't take the Tea Party seriously enough and address their issue, what comes next will be much uglier. And you can argue some of that's what's happened with Trump. We have essentially people who are frustrated. They're not listened to. No one's going to listen to them anyway. Why should we be polite? The only way to get anything done is to be rude, abrasive, and forceful, essentially, as opposed to working through a regular democratic process of open debate and discussion, moderation, etc. You have much more vigorous and much more angry politics. The people seem to, and this is Adams would argue, go back to John Adams, the pattern in history, this is not a new pattern at all. Human beings are not infinitely creative. Societies have familiar patterns one sees over and over again. And one pattern is when a runaway elite happens, the common people will turn to one big person, often a rich person, who says, who understands why they're angry and appeals to them, perhaps for his own ambition, but uses that to ride himself into power, and then he will, to a degree, punch back down on the elite. With the other parts of the elite, no elite is entirely unified. And I do think that's part of what we're seeing in America today. The kicker is, ironically, thanks to the abuse of the term democracy, we have the elites don't recognize themselves as such, and the word meritocracy, I suppose. They think they're actually just representing what all sensible people think, and they're being democratic. It's this interesting form of democracy when so often what they want, sometimes it is what the people want, but what they want is not actually supported by the people.
So there was a time in our history when being in the Senate was a stepping stone to the presidency. But in recent times, we've seen governors really dominating the office. And now we have a celebrity billionaire. The Senate really has lost a lot of its prestige, you could argue. Do you think it can ever get its mojo back?
That's a very tough question. Without significant institutional reform, I fear that might not happen. Right? I think given 100 senators and 435 congressmen and popular election of senators, the senators feel like they're just kind of big congressmen. I don't know how you can get back the sense that being a senator is something special, right? And without that, you won't have the same type of dynamic I do believe was at work in the United States in a good chunk of the 19th century. But maybe I'm a little too pessimistic. If some other changes in our system could, in fact, perhaps produce that. But it's interesting looking over time at how the main path to the presidency has changed, right? Yeah, recently it has been governors, although Obama was a senator, Kennedy was a senator, between that and Johnson was a senator, Nixon, of course. Then, right, you had governors, and but we'll see what happens next. It could be billionaires drop in who've never had another office before, but I don't think that's going to happen because my guess is billionaires might start running for other offices first. Maybe not, but we'll see what happens with that. The challenge, again, is to make sure that those who have a lot of power in society are somehow accountable, as opposed to just having the ability to have great influence and can just walk away as if nothing happened with their reputation intact, etc. No notion that they've done anything wrong when their plans cause damage to the republic.
Professor Samuelson, we can't let a discussion on the Senate pass without talking about its biggest task this fall, which is confirming the next Supreme Court justice. Given the present state of the Senate and the rancor in Washington, do you think it will go relatively smoothly? What would a Senate of Adelsons and Soros and Oprahs and Professor Samuelsons do differently?
It's interesting. I don't know. I think it would be more interesting to have more sustained discussions about what a constitution is and what it's for, and the relationship of the democratic process to the constitutional process. But that's a very academic answer, I suppose. I think it might be in a more healthy democratic culture, more people will be interested in that. But I do think in terms of what we have now, it's very interesting, right? One can argue the confirmation process is not actually a legislative process. The Senate is primarily a legislative changer. But insofar as it is doing things on the appointments clause is in Article 2, that is the executive power. So the Senate is effectively a council of state, advising the president and consenting with him. What became practice, however, merely consent. When Washington had to negotiate the first treaty he was going to negotiate with, I believe, the Creek Indians, he brought a Secretary of War, Henry Knox, there. Jefferson had yet to arrive to be Secretary of State and said, let's discuss, advise me, essentially, how are we going to approach this negotiation? And it didn't work out. They said, we can't have open discussion with George Washington here, and they kicked him out, essentially. And from then on, the Senate has essentially put aside its advice role and became primarily involved in consent. Now, any smart president knows there are going to be some leaders in the Senate. In every group, there are a few leaders, right? And you keep them informed if you want anything to pass. That was Woodrow Wilson's mistake in the end of World War I. That's part of the reason the treaty for League of Nations didn't pass. He was too alienated from the actual leadership of the Senate. But in the confirmation process, right, that's what's interesting about we do not have the filibuster for appointments anymore. And so the Republicans have the numbers, assuming everybody holds the line just for it to run through. And the whole set of meetings and public questioning is actually just for show, because we kind of know how people are going to come out, unless the only goal is to have someone say something outrageous, which will change enough votes to end the confirmation process. And as long as that does not happen, it's not, the result is kind of foreordained, right? I can't remember which senator it was after John Roberts' confirmation hearing. Maybe it's the end of one of the days, says, you're the best guy we ever had in front of us. He was so good at answering questions in a way that both gave something of an answer but didn't do anything that got in the way. I think he was the one of the senators said, he essentially corrected her question. I think it was Senator Feinstein. I could be correct. And said, okay, you explain to me what this means, because he knew the Constitution much better than Senator Feinstein did, or any senator is my guess, right? But the confirmation process, unfortunately, it's a big game. The court, the problem with the court right now is it's kind of become an uber legislature, which is not its job, right? In one sense, are human beings equal? We're not equal in talents. We're not equal in abilities. We're not equal in power in society and practice. We're equal in the right to pursue pursue happiness. Well, happiness in the founding generations was connected with virtue. That is, they were optimistic. That what makes people happy? Generally leading decent lives is more likely to make people happy than being thieves. So you're right to run your life as you choose. So you're right also to think about moral questions. If we take away from the people the right to have discussions about right and wrong and say, no, that's something the court decides because those are all questions of rights, in what sense are people equal? If we're not allowed, if we don't think the common person is capable of making moral judgments, and also on those things where there are differing moral judgments, to have an open discussion in our political system, right? We're actually pointing back towards aristocracy, and maybe worse, the notion that most people really aren't capable of managing their own lives because they're not going to make good choices. That's very problematic for a democratic system. So ironically, the Adamsian argument was that you need to essentially you're going to have an elite, and the challenge is to keep them in line, to use them to serve the system, because only that way can you actually have enough respect for the demos among the people who are actually going to want to run their own lives, because no one really wants to be in charge of their own life. They get away with it. Someone takes care of them. Thank you. And they don't realize that's actually not making you happy. But and that's related to the confirmation process, because it seems to me the reason why the confirmation process matters so darn much is because the court has taken away so much power from the people and from the legislative process. And that's part of what's causing so much frustration in the system. Part of the reason it doesn't matter quite so much to be a senator is any serious decision gets reviewed by the court. And so they don't really have the right to make legislation about serious things. I mean, they can alter the whole healthcare system, right? But in other ways, their powers are greatly diminished.
So finally, PRI is close to wine country, and we all love wine. So it's been our tradition at PRI to ask every podcast guest for a wine or cocktail recommendation. So school's out, summer's here. What adult beverage are you enjoying this summer under the Southern California sun?
Well, it's kind of funny. I'm not really the biggest wine drinker in the world, but someone gave me a bottle of the Jefferson bourbon. It's actually quite good. It's very, very much in accord with the founding. It's actually quite a nice drink. So I do not know if that was in fact Jefferson's recipe. I suspect not, but I don't know that. Maybe it was, right? I know since Sam Adams beer came online, everybody wants every founder's recipe for beer and other types of alcohol. But as a bourbon, it's quite good.
Thanks, Professor Samuelson. Thanks to our guest, Professor Richard Samuelson, and to my colleague Tim Anaya. To read more of Richard Samuelson's work, go to Claremont Review of Books and also commentary. And if you're in the Southern California area, please join us Thursday, September 13th for our annual Baroness Thatcher Gala in Newport Beach. This year, we're honoring Governor Pete Wilson on his 85th birthday. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for another episode of PRI's podcast.